Hi, my name is Ben Black. I'm the founder of Akkadian Ventures. We're a secondary fund here in San Francisco. And I am also the co-founder of Raise. I'm very happy to be here today with an old friend of mine, Eva Ho of Fika Ventures in Los Angeles. And truth be told, I'm an investor. I have been for a long time, and I've really appreciated the way that Fika has built their business. Eva, you wanted to sort of give us your background, tell us a little bit about the firm?
Yeah, sure thing, Ben. It's an honor to be here. I've been a big fan of yours and the Raise conference. And for folks who are listening, I was one of the early attendees of Raise several years back and got value from it day one. So really thrilled that you're continuing this tradition with this event. It's so critical for folks getting started because a lot of young managers just don't know where to go to get the right advice and content and network. And I think Raise is fantastic in covering all those things. So a pleasure to be here with you today. Yeah, Fika was my second fund, honestly. I started with Sousa Ventures in 2013. It was a inaugural like $25 million dollar fund that was among some friends who moved from being co-angel investors to doing something a little bit more formal. Back then, we really didn't know what the heck we were doing, but was very lucky to sort of learn the ropes through Sousa One, and really at that point had to decide whether this is a career I want to do it for a while or I could just kind of do it at a small scale, with just with close friends. And going through that first process with Sousa, I learned a lot. I mean, in a sense, I like what I was doing. I, honestly wasn't sure whether I was actually going to be really good at it for a long time because, as you know, the time horizon for these funds are really long. But I knew I wanted to do it further. I think the decision point for me was like, did I want to do with these three folks, or do it with another partner? The only reason I went with TX was I wanted a smaller partnership and I wanted to refocus in Los Angeles. So
Tell us about TX. How
yeah,
did you find TX, and what was the inception of that relationship? Did you know him for a long
yeah,
time before?
I did. I knew him for 5 years before we actually formalized the fund. And I know a lot of fund managers struggle or are thinking through this. I think we have the very sort of successful solo capitalists and other folks who are just thinking like, I might want to do this. Should I go about it by myself or bring on a partner? And I'm very biased on this. Honestly, I think running a small fund, and your fund is not small, Ben, but I think we both appreciate the amount of work, the unsexy work that goes into running a fund. And I feel lucky every day to have TX because definitely don't think I could do this by myself.
How do you get from like I started to the tipping point where you have real institutional investors? I mean, that's a huge gap, and it's one that is underappreciated in just the difficulty of it. Like, people sort of look at, some people go out there and they're like, wow, I started out with 4 endowments, but like usually it's a long process, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a fascinating environment for these folks to go out now versus I think
right.
when you and I started this a few years back, it's a completely different place and time to do it.
Yeah.
And it feels like the skills you need. I won't say it's harder. I think it's just different,
Yeah.
Back then you had less competition, but there were fewer LPs that wanted to invest in emerging managers. And today, it's more competitive, but there are also more LPs available.
So tell me, when you first started talking to TX, how long did it take you to sort of get going and to sort of get the fund conceptualized? How did you think about it, and how did you sort of how long did that take before you started actually fundraising for the fund?
Yeah, I think we were thinking about it for about a year. And we honestly thought about other permutations of him joining Sousa or me joining his family office fund called Carlin Ventures. So before we decided to just jump ship, which has lots of issues and challenges of jumping ship, and as you know, Ben, we thought about different ways of working together. And finally we said, hey, let's just have a clean slate and let's start this as Fika. So from the beginning of saying like we should do this, to actually going out and talking to our first set of LPs, it was probably about 9 months. And then once we started talking to LPs, it took 7 months for Fika One to get off the ground. And I always tell the story, like we knocked on 600 doors.
Like, let's talk about that. Like, how did you build that? So how big was the fund, the first fund?
40.
And so what was your target for a first close?
We 25 was the
Uh,
target, and we closed our second close pretty quickly after.
mhm.
But yeah, I think, I think for first time folks going out, I think relying on people to help you build that initial database of people and being fairly shameless about it, honestly. Because I think TX and I came into it, we both of us, and Ben, a little bit of our history, but we didn't come from wealthy families, or we didn't come from the typical sort of lineage, if you want to call it. We didn't come from Silicon Valley, so we didn't have a natural like community of honestly family offices and endowments and folks to go after. So we had to start a bit on ground level. And so I think every person we talked to, if they liked us and there was some mutual chemistry, they would recommend us to one or two people. And slowly we built that list of 600. Eventually we got a handful of those to say yes. But yeah, it was a grind. And, a lot of folks who just want to go like snap up and raise a fund, I say, hey, think about it carefully, because it's not that I'm discouraging them, but it's a shitload of work, to get
Right, so
going.
let's go like is that. Wait, so I mean, 600 sounds very overwhelming. How did you get like? I mean, what was the list you started with, and who were the first sort of commitments that you had? That sort of got you going.
Yeah, I think when you talk about volume of that nature, if you really, really badly want to do this, the ideal is if you have a partner who also is very sort of aligned with you in doing the rote tasks of getting things set up and following a very sort of rigorous process. It's kind of like inside sales or selling, right? Every week you have to like line up stuff, you have to get going. And it's not a fun process necessarily, but if you don't have a partner with you that is every week, like we're cutting down the numbers and culling the list and doing follow up. It's very hard to do it on your own. But I think the early commitments that we got, being so fortunate as Greenspring, they had known us for a bit through the Sousa relationship. We've known Hunter Somerville for quite a while. So it wasn't a brand new relationship. But when he met TX and myself, he was like, oh my God, this is a pretty differentiated product. And they quickly committed, and they typically didn't do first funds, and we're very lucky they committed, and that snowballed and helped us get other institutional
Oh,
folks involved. A lot of first funds don't have this good fortune of
that,
having a lever,
yeah, that's a really good first. They were part of your first close.
Yeah, they were actually our first institutional LP. And
Wow.
yeah, we were, and I mean, to be honest, I think, and I'm not doing this because I'm like fluffing them up, but not only did they help us sort of get make the first commitment, but they introduced us to a bunch of their friends, and have been doing that for the last 3 years. We've been with them consistently. They have said, hey, like talk to the Fika folks. They have something really different. You may like them. And it's been a tremendous help. So emerging managers that are out there, like when you get one strong champion, it really, really helps. And Greenspring is one of the top shops up there because their network is like sickly large. So
What did they see as your differentiation?
I think a lot of it, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear from them. But when we pitch them in the partnership, Ashton and Jim and John, Seon, I think we came across so different. I mean, certainly like our strategy was fairly clear. Like we do enterprise, we do B2B, we do 50% LA, high conviction, a lot of stuff that, probably other funds are saying today, back then and today. But I think they really just bought into TX and myself. Like they felt this is a really neat, just two people, very different backgrounds, very interesting deal flow, and really interesting compounded experience that they can bring to founders. And of course, they did very deep diligence, talked to a bunch of founders. It helped that the first fund we had a dozen founders that put in small checks.
So did you get those founders before you went to fundraise? Okay.
Yeah, I
That's a
did.
really good, that's good, really good tactical piece of advice is to get your founders to agree to invest in your next fund. Like that's great advice there.
Yeah, I've been telling that to a lot of folks who are getting started, that if you go out there having those sort of proof points or social proof, even if they put in 25, 50,000, it matters a lot because a lot of these founders are very young, and for them 50,000 is a lot of money. They haven't made it big. They're not unicorn founders. But the fact that they like, kind of validated us through their checkbooks, was really helpful in getting going. And again, so grateful for them. But yeah, we had like 12, 15 of those folks. And then Greenspring obviously used them as references. But with any sort of,
Are there any other ways that you did social proof, that you created social proof at the very, very beginning before you got Greenspring?
I mean, I think because TX and I are a bit of a known entity in the Valley, and my last company, Factual, was backed by Andreessen, that I think early days, like what a Greenspring does, and any sort of the decent LPs out there, like they just back channel and call around. So you give them your reference list, but honestly, that doesn't count for much. They're going to do their work on the back end, and they typically don't even call the folks that's on your reference list, except some of the founders. And so Greenspring is a very high diligence machine, and they talk to a lot of other VCs and folks out there, and was like, what do you think of even TX? Like, would you take money from them? And have they helped you in the past? And that's sort of the biggest thing is, young managers out there. I'm like, make sure like you really do the work and get out there and be helpful to people, because it's going to compound and come back and pay it forward to you. If you haven't done that before, it's a little harder to prove it. But when they did the back references, I think it was very clear that TX and I added value to the founder community, and people felt that we also had like kind of differentiated domain expertise because we built companies before and stuff like that. So that helped.
What about track record at that very point? Like, what kind of track record did you both have, and how much do you think that what track record you had as an investor mattered, or is it really your foundation, your founder experience, your operating experience that carried the day?
Track record mattered, and it was difficult because it wasn't easy to get the track record direct from Sousa or from the Carlin family. I think when we separated, there's some interesting things we had to negotiate. But I think the great thing is I left Sousa on good terms, and they were able to say, hey, we really like Eva. It didn't work out, but she contributed in the following ways. I think some LPs really specifically say which deals specifically were attributed to you, and they really want direct attribution. And luckily I had a handful of those, and those have turned out to be great companies, whether they're like Andela, Policy Genius, or whatnot from the Sousa One portfolio. But back then they were still young, so it wasn't like clear. It wasn't clear like I discovered a unicorn or anything like that. And to be very frank, like Robinhood, which is our biggest one for Sousa One, was actually not me. It was Chad's thing. So I was just very transparent. Like this is what I did in Sousa One. And I said, you could talk to them for that. And TX had his own portfolio from Carlin. So he did have a track record because he invested in like 30 companies. Some of them are quite large, like Figs, and he did SoFi when he was an innovation. So both of us had somewhat of a track record. If you're brand new and you haven't been part of a fund, I think today it's having even some strong angel checks into some decent, logos would get you like halfway there. So don't be discouraged, I guess, if you don't, have all the dots checked. We didn't, but we had, we did have some, we even made some investments in the past.
So what was the low point for you in raising your first fund? What was the hardest thing you had to work through?
We did get some rejections early on, and I think I told TX that if we only were able to raise 25, I was actually going to step back and let him run the fund because it wasn't quite enough for two people. And I knew TX could do it. So yeah, so we had that discussion when we got a couple of rejections. I'm like, well, if we didn't know whether we're going to get to 40, honestly, getting out there. And we had to explain we had a lot of headwinds, like explaining why did you leave Sousa and why did you leave Carlin and why LA for enterprise, like in 2016, that was still a bit weird. And why LA, back then LA is not LA today. So I would say 60% of the LPs was like, okay, cute, but not for us. But I guess, the sort of the moral of the story is like, you only need like a couple for your first one. And if you can convince, and even if you don't get those couple and you have all family offices and individuals, it's still fine. Like I have friends who are trying to raise 25, 30, they're at 15, 20. And I'm like, don't be discouraged because you could do a lot with that. With 15, 20, just go invest and build those relationship with founders, be useful. And LPs will be open to you again in like a year and a half. So, it might seem really awful, but it really isn't if you're committed to this career, and it's not an easy career, but.
Did you get any other institutional investors in that $25 million first close? Or was it mostly high net worth individuals, family offices?
We had a couple. We had Cross Creek come in. Yeah, we had Knollwood, the Knollwood family, that's been with us again from those days, and they were fantastic too. So yeah, it was all sort of through the Greenspring extended family.
Mhm.
Yeah, and other great LPs like Horsley, whatever, they all have their own networks, and it's a very sort of, in somewhat, a very incestuous type of thing, and it's, in many ways, it's very positive. And I'm always, when I'm talking to folks who are just struggling up that hill to get that first one, and I tend to like share a lot of my LPs because I just believe it's good for the world to be able to help others, because that's how we got started. I give them sort of tips on different ones. Like, some of the folks that we have are great folks, but they tend to like to follow, right? They're like, okay, I'm
Right.
not going to do your first close. So, when you're like 75% there, give me a call. And so I would work with managers and say, hey, that's how they like to behave. There's nothing wrong with it. And just, but, put them in the back end, and don't
Right.
spend your time like, get this other person first, and try to like prioritize your conversations and whatnot, and building some of that urgency, just the same as what we tell when founders are pitching. So.
And I know that you had a conference. So I tell everyone about the conference that you at least had before the pandemic hit. I assume you'll do it again.
Yeah, it's a great thing, Ben. I think if people could pull it off, it's been very good for us. And same as what you do at Raise, right? You become known for building a community, and it's called First Look. And we started about 4 or 5 years ago. And
That before
you know,
your first close? Did you have it before your first close or no?
we did. We actually
Yep.
did the first one with Susa. When TX, that was one of the first things we did together. And then we realized our networks were, interestingly overlapping but different. And we're like, oh, that helps us in general. But yeah, it's really neat to be able to do that, because it became sort of one of the showcase events in Los Angeles. And the principle was really simple. Like, we have a lot of great companies here, but the rest of the world didn't know about this market, and a lot of the founders here felt very like sort of closed in and sort of provincial. Like, they're like, should I talk to Silicon Valley, like, you know VC, like, how do I make these connections, especially if you're not from like Venice and Santa Monica, right? Like, you're you know downtown LA or Silver Lake, and you're like, I just want to break in. So we do this conference where we bring in a lot of the top VCs from around the country. And then we also bring a lot of the unicorn founders from around the country, like the CEO of Compass and Okta, and all these great folks from all over, so that the founders can get exposure to more people and ultimately build like really, hopefully meaningful relationships. It's not supposed to be for us like a networking thing. We don't really like super transactional things, but it's a very intimate, invite only, free for all. Yeah, and I think for folks out there who are trying to build their brand, like, you'd be surprised if you ask, like, the conference that we run is completely sponsored, because as a tiny fund, like, we can't afford paying $150,000 to run like, kind of like a wedding almost, and it's a lot of work, but we would not be able to do it without the dollars and support from other folks. And so I encourage folks, whatever their method is, it doesn't have to be an event. You'd be surprised if you ask folks for help. As a sort of young manager, you can get a lot of support, and hack your way sort of into the system.
So
Yeah.
600 LP reach out list. How many of those 600 were actually in your first close?
Of the 41 million we raised, about 70% were institutional, and about 30% were individuals and family offices. And that's pretty lucky. And there are some people who do better than that, and they're able, like the really well-known.
That's actually, I tell you this, talking to managers, that's a very high percentage of institutional for a first close on a first time fund. Usually it's one institution and 80% of the money comes from high net worth individuals. And, did you get other venture capitalists to invest?
We didn't. Back then, it wasn't so much of a thing. I know now, like, great firms like Lightspeed and others are doing this, and I always just introduce them to the young firms, because I think that's great validation, and I know why Lightspeed wants to play this strategy, so it's a win-win for both sides. But no, we didn't, and now I think we're a little late for them. But yeah, I think today there's actually like many VCs that will put $1-3 million checks into funds, which is great.
How is the first close different from the second close?
I think once we got to 25, like, we felt at least a little more confident, like the first like 300 conversations, you have no freaking idea, like, whether it's resonating with anybody. Right. And,
Yeah.
and I think for folks out there who are, young managers, like, you also can't correlate like enthusiasm during the call with, conversion. And that's why we have so much empathy for founders, right? They deal with this BS all the time. But yeah, we have folks who are really excited, and then they'll be like, I'll give you $150,000. And I'm like, man, after like data room access and everything. And I'm teasing. And again, we couldn't have gotten there without those smaller checks too. But yeah, for managers who are going out there, like tactically, like you don't have a lot of choice necessarily for the first fund. And but I have little tips, like if you're closing friends and family that are doing like say 50 to 150, to collect it all up front, because the fund admin in the back end can be, a bit of a pain. So little things like that makes it more palatable when you're like some of these young funds have like 100, LPs. It's fine, honestly, but there are ways to make sort of the management of that moving forward like a little easier.
A lot of people will close smaller amounts. It's sort of like if they're doing a $40 million fund, they'll close 15. What would you say are the pros and cons of just closing earlier, getting some deals in the fund versus keeping going to the point where you have 60% of your fund raised to do your first close?
I don't have a strong opinion because it's so dependent on pipeline and your ability to warehouse good deals. Like if you truly have visibility into 40, like if you're doing 40 and you close at 15, or 50, you close at 15, like if you don't think you have visibility, like I would just rethink the strategy a bit. If you don't, like if there's like a high probability you're not going to get to the 40, 50, and it's not so simple as saying, well, I want to aim for 40, 50, but I only got to 15 and I just stop at 20. Like that's not quite fair. And most LPs won't accept that, because that's a totally different shift in strategy and portfolio construction. I'm okay with that. Like today, I think if you're going to 15, you close at 15 because things were a little drawn out. Those folks are anxious to put some money to work. You have some good deal flow, and you want to also be in market and demonstrating you can win decent deals. Like I'm totally like, that's fine. That's fine. But I'm less good if you then decide to just like get lazy and close on half of it and call it a day, because your LPs are not sophisticated and didn't ask for any provisions to say you have to like hit some sort of minimum, whatever. Like I'm less good with that.
So really, last question. If you have to look back on the process of getting to your first close, reaching that moment, like what was the one piece of advice like that you give people, that was not intuitive, something that you had to learn on the job in the moment, that would be great to share with managers coming in today?
I think really like owning your story. I know that's maybe a little trite, but having not done it before, and SUSO 1 was different because it was like, we were super well networked. We didn't take it as seriously. It was kind of like a fun thing that we did. So there's like a lot less pressure. Fika 1 felt like we were starting from scratch. And I think making sure your story is really consistent and strong, and you really know your numbers and your math is really important. And maybe that's not contrarian to what other people's advice, but I think, and it doesn't work with all LPs. Like some people like, wow, like I don't want to hear your whatever, like how you grew up and stuff. But I think because TX and our background story is pretty unique, I would like to say, that when we shared some bits of it to say, hey, like, we honestly never thought we were going to be VCs. Like this is in the wildest dreams. We never thought we would be here. And we feel like we still have to earn our way in. Just because we had past successful companies, it doesn't matter. Like, why should I deserve to get 40 million bucks from you guys? And coming in with, I think, that humility balanced with some confidence, but we feel like we can do it because of these skills that we bring to the table and this network, et cetera. But sharing sort of that background for us like really helped, because I think the LPs, like a lot of them are like, I remember that story that you told, Eva, of how you grew up and how TX grew up and some of the things that you overcame. And yet like the distance travel from where you started and where you are today is pretty far. And I think that stuck with them, like this girl and this guy, they're not going to give up. They're going to do everything to make sure they return your money and more. And I think that was very, for them, like this was not a hobby thing for us. And I think for a lot of LPs, they want that sincerity and they want that commitment, and whatever you could show to demonstrate you want to do this for 30 years. I think that's the thing that you have to like hit home.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Happy investor, glad to know you, and really appreciate all the work you've done, and respect what you've built. So thanks for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you so much,
Great.
Ben. Always so fun chatting with you.